Now that we know how data binding works, let's take a look at creating a form in our application where the user can now enter a new employee or edit an existing one. And we'll link this up in the demo with methods on our API. We've already discussed that data entry in HTML applications is always going to be based on a form. While we can use the regular HTML form and the input tag in Blazor, like we've already covered, Blazor comes with a number of ready-made input components that we can use in a form, and these will help us in creating our forms. The form itself will be an edit form. For the common HTML inputs, corresponding Blazor input components exist. We'll look at these in just a minute. These components, of course, will support again data binding. On top of that, they will also support a validation, which we'll see in the final part of this module. Through the use of some CSS classes, these components have a built-in behavior that they will, for example, get a red outline, but if needed, we can customize this. Let's build up a form step by step, since there are a few things here to understand. For starters, the form. The HTML form itself has a Blazor version, let's say, the edit form. That's a built-in component in Blazor, and we'll place our input components in there in just a minute. Before we do that, we first need to set the model for the edit form. And here I'm setting that to employee. Employee is an instance of the type employee, and it's exposed here in the component class through the employee property. The edit form will create an edit context based on this model. And through the edit context, Blazor can check which fields inside of the form have been edited or which validation errors have happened. Key thing here, we use the edit form and we set the model to an instance here of type employee. Now in the form, we'll do most of the work. We'll expose the number of components to allow the user to enter information. Blazor comes as set equipped with an extensive set of components to allow for user input. Technically, you can see them as wrappers around existing HTML inputs. They will render the corresponding HTML input. We have the input text, which is the Blazor version of the HTML input type equals text. The text area allows for text input too, but multi-line. The input number also accepts input, but only numeric values are accepted. Input select creates an HTML select, so a drop-down, and I think you can imagine what the input date will do. Next, you have the input checkbox, input radio, and input radio group. The latter allows us to group a number of input radio components, and only one can be selected within the group. Finally, we have the input file, which allows us to create a file upload in our Blazor apps. The Blazor input components are, as you may have expected, components. They inherit from the input base class, and one of the things they do on top of rendering the corresponding HTML output is adding support for validation. How this works depends on the used component. We'll see that in the next part. These input components, like their regular HTML counterparts, support two-way data binding too, however with a slightly different syntax. Let's look at some code. Here's our form, now with a single input component added, an input text. For it to data bind, we now use the addBind-value, and it's also set to a property that we can send the data to through data binding. Again, this will render as an HTML input, and entered values will be sent to the property. Notice that we can, and should, in fact, use regular HTML attributes such as class and ID on the Blazor input components. These will be copied verbatim to the rendered output. Here you can see another component, the input select, which will render as a combo box, a drop-down. The bind value is pointing to where we can get and set this selected value. The options here will be countries. We are going to loop using a for each over all countries. Countries will be a list in the component class, and for each one, we're going to create an option. That's what the select expects in HTML. The value is set to the country.countryID, and we display the country name. We'll use a few selects in the upcoming demo too. Of course, once the user has entered all the information, or that's what we hope at least, they should be able to submit the form. We have a couple of callbacks available for this, to which we can simply attach an event handler and take it from there. The onValidSubmit can be used to trigger an event handler when a valid form is submitted. In other words, built-in validation will need to be satisfied, and then, when the form is submitted, the linked event handler will be called. OnValidSubmit works in tandem with OnInvalidSubmit, which will trigger if we submit the form with still invalid fields. We can also opt to trigger code regardless if the form is valid or not. For that, we have the onSubmit, and in the event handler, we can then handle validation manually. We will in our demo use onValidSubmit and onInvalidSubmit. Here is the updated form, now containing the onValidSubmit and onInvalidSubmit. Both point to an event handler, a method basically, in the component class.